KPFB Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF Fresno, and online at kpfa.org. This is Education Today, and I'm your host for today, Kimberly Mayfield Lynch. Today, we are going to have a magnificent conversation with Tracy D. Hall on Black information futures. The ability to remember is a form of power. That quote from writer and theorist Bell Hooks was printed on cards and handed to every single person, including me, who walked into the first ever Black Information Futures Symposium earlier this year in Seattle. It's a deceptively simple sentence, and it contains a world. Today on Education Today, we're talking about what it means for Black communities to not just access information, but to shape it, own it, preserve it, and imagine its future. We're talking about who gets to be a librarian, who gets to be remembered, and who decides what knowledge is worth keeping. My guest is one of the most important voices in American information and library life. She was the first Black woman to lead the American Library Association in its nearly 150-year history. She is a poet, a playwright, a researcher, and now a professor of practice at the University of Washington's Information School, where she leads the Black Information Futures Initiative. And she is a very, very old and good friend of mine, Tracy D. Hall. Welcome to Education Today.
Thank you, Dr. Mayfield.
Tracy, you've defined Black information futures as, and I want to quote this precisely, the ability of Black people to gain equitable analog and digital access to the information and information technologies needed to achieve and sustain social agency, authorship, educational attainment, economic mobility, environmental responsiveness, and stewardship, and collective well-being. That's a remarkable sentence. It's comprehensive, it's aspirational, but it's also urgent. So can you tell us, where did this framework come from for you personally? And I understand it goes back to your grandparents, to something you noticed as a child about reading and access.
Yes, absolutely. And, I want to say before I, talk about like my own origin story and why I became so focused, even obsessed with information, I just want to talk about where we are in this moment, in 2026,
yes,
when we think about access to information really driving lifetime opportunities around, things like education, employment, and even healthcare. So when we think about information as currency, we can see it as making a difference between how we're going to navigate, if we're going to navigate the systems that surround us, and what side we're going to be on. And also who will be left behind. So, I just wanted to say that because as you were quoting, that definition, that came to me as I was thinking specifically about something that seems really generic. And it was about, at the time, living in Chicago and taking my laptop from the South Side to the north side. And if you know Chicago, in any city, you have a side that is less heavily resourced, and a side that seems like all the resources accumulate there. But taking my laptop from one place to the other and opening it, I saw, just in terms of internet ads and premiums and things that were coming up as I was working, I saw a world of difference in terms of what I could see and what was being offered. And I thought about geofencing and the ways in which the zip code that I was in was really driving what people thought of me. The same person, same city, but a different location. And so, when I think about how we, all people, and specifically Black people, are going to need to navigate the information future, I thought about all of those things. And so when I think about my own origin story, of course, my grandparents had so much to do with it. My maternal grandparents, in particular, had limited formal education and even literacy, right? So both of them came of age in rural Louisiana at a time when the great library building programs by people like Carnegie and others were really focused on major cities rather than rural towns, and when library segregation prevailed. So at the time that my grandmother would have been, a child and a young woman, only 1 in 5 Black people in Louisiana could even use a library, ostensibly. So when I started school and I became a reader, I could see that as brilliant as my maternal grandparents were, both of them, such quick thinkers, they weren't fluent readers. And so I wondered why, and that's when I began, particularly because my grandmother introduced me to the library. She got me my first library card. But I knew that there was something to see there, that there was something that was important and maybe even restrictive about access to information. So I was already connecting the dots between who had access to information, who had access to the library or the archive, or even to technology, to what I was seeing growing up in my home, that there was some type of disparity that I wanted to get closer to and put my finger on.
Thank you. Thank you. You've written about U.S. anti-literacy laws that specifically criminalize the act of teaching enslaved people to read, that restrict their ability to obtain documents, to communicate, to organize, laws designed essentially to sever the people from information. So when we talk about information inequity today, digital divides, algorithmic bias, underrepresentation in library collections, how much of that is, in your view, a continuation of that history? And are we still living inside those anti-literacy laws in some form?
I would definitely say yes. To that question, are we still living inside of anti-literacy laws? Yes, we are as a nation. And we can see that because we're at a point in our nation's history where upwards of 20% of people in the United States can't read past the 5th grade level, right? So that's something that we know. And we're seeing literacy rates decrease for young people, even as they have really a level of access and a digital nativity, like a level of access to technology, and they are digital natives. That doesn't always translate into meaning making, which is at the foundation of literacy. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes we believe that because technology is ubiquitous, we must be becoming more literate as a society. When we can see statistically that the actual converse is true, right? But if we look at Dr. Mayfield, a map of the states that are behind the widest calls for censorship today, right? And if we compare that to a map of the states that enacted the most egregious punishments for Black literacy, for Black people learning to read or even being caught reading, we can see the connection and the continuation at play, right? And when I say egregious punishment, I'm talking, of course, about lashing, about whipping, about people being incarcerated, about people being fined, but even things more egregious, such as, the cutting off of fingers and the gouging out of eyes. And we also know that in terms of the Black Code laws, that some of the stiffest punishments that white people face was in being being caught teaching Black people to read, so much so that you see all of these really ingenious ways to kind of escape some of those laws, such as creating floating schools, on waters that sort of border states, so as to almost be stateless in creating these educational access points. But even if you look at it in terms of, what's happening today with censorship, we can see that if we look at race of author, that overwhelmingly, if we single out race of author, we can see that Black authors are being targeted. And if we look at race and gender, then we can see that literature by Black women is more likely to be banned than any other literature by any other single identity, followed very closely, of course, by books by LGBTQIA authors or that contain LGBTQIA content. And then after that, books that talk about civil rights or that talk about social justice. So I think we can, again, to see sort of like this circular logic, returning. But if we look at it by state, then we can sort of look at, say, South Carolina, right? South Carolina, enforced some of the strictest laws against teaching enslaved people to read. And in Charleston, a few years ago, we see that at least by 2025, that Moms for Liberty, which is one of the biggest pro-censorship groups in the United States, occupied 5 of the 8 seats on the school board, right? If you look at Louisiana, right?
Wow, Tracy.
Yes. Yes. Right?
Oh my gosh.
I stop there.
No, just go on, because that, hidden in plain sight, it really calls on the voters to be very vigilant about the histories and the prior actions and the interests of those that they are voting for. That's astounding. It made me have a flashback to the neighborhood councils and the Klan being hidden in plain sight, but you not knowing who they were, but in elected office. That piece of information you just gave took me right back there.
Exactly. And I'm so glad you said that. And I'll just say one more. Of course, we could talk about Louisiana, right, where you and I both have Mississippi, Alabama, where I live today, Georgia, Virginia. All of these states had really, if you look at them, very draconian Black Code laws that restricted the right to read. But just look at Texas, for instance, where, we celebrate Juneteenth because we know that it was a trifecta of low literacy, information suppression, but also brutality that kept Black people in bondage, after the Emancipation Proclamation. But if you look, and by 2023 at Houston Public Schools, the new superintendent at that time famously or infamously decided to shift school libraries and make them detention centers and literal pipelines to incarceration, right? That literally a school to prison pipeline. Wow. And of course, I'm hoping that your listeners are also diligent researchers so that they can fact check, everything that I am sharing, because as your original question is, is there a connection today? I would say there is, and it's exacerbated by the fact that we have, as a collective, and in terms of our collective consciousness, we have forgotten the connection between, censorship and information suppression, and how both of them, have deep roots in American history. And we also, though, at the same time, have champions who have stood up against them. And I think, that is why, when we look at our First Amendment, right, we see the right to read and the right to assemble and the right to protest, all protected under the same amendment.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. So in June of last year, 2025, you took a group of information professionals and memory workers to, I think it's your home city, Montgomery, Alabama, to the Equal Justice Initiative's sites, to the former Colored Library branch managed by Bertha Pleasant Williams, to the Rosa Parks Museum, to the home where the Freedom Riders were sheltered after being beaten. You wanted the initiative to be, as you put it, grounded and embodied. So can you tell us why it was important that intellectual work happened in a physical place, in Montgomery specifically, rather than in a seminar or over Zoom?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, right. Why not over Zoom, right? It can accomplish like our closest to teleportation. So, definitely, Montgomery's my adopted city now, right? So I'm from, South Central LA. So shout out to 103rd Street.
That's right.
Stand up.
That's right.
That's right. Compton, Linwood, you know what it is, right? Chicago is another adopted home for me. And I cut, my ideological and teeth at UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah. Go Gauchos.
And go Gauchos, right? And go the great Cedric Robinson and,
That's right.
and all of our professors, Claudia Michelle, and,
Yes.
all of the people, Gerard Pigeon, Gerald Horn, all the great scholars, whose feet we sat at, Sylvia Curtis, the great librarian there at that time, and also the University of Washington Information School, where I think I really kind of honed my thinking about information. But Montgomery really shows up for me because of its historical, its political, its psychic and ancestral importance, right? It's a loaded geography. So it was important to me that, when we think about Black information futures, I didn't want that to feel removed from scholarship. But I also didn't want it to be removed from community, right? I wanted it to be central to both. So I really wanted to be in a place where scholarship really came to life, right? So that when we think about the great Dr. King, he came to Montgomery, when he was heading Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, he came to, he was ABD, right? So he came, he thought he was choosing a quieter place, outside of Atlanta so he could work on his dissertation and finish it, when in fact he was drafted into a movement that was larger than him. And we kind of see that happening again and again, that Montgomery becomes this place where scholarship comes to life. So I wanted it to be something also where we could really look on real terms about how information could be used for as a tool for agency and liberation. And I have I'm thinking about two stories, because one, you mentioned Dr. Mayfield, Bertha Pleasant Williams, right?
Yes.
So she was, she did her undergrad in library science at Alabama State University, one of the great HBCUs, founded by formerly enslaved people. And she wanted to go on to University of Alabama for her master's degree in library and information science, but she was unfortunately denied at that time because she was Black. And so she sued, and she was told, we will give you support, financial support, but you can't go to school in the state So she went to Atlanta University at the time that it had a library school. But she was later, when the city of Montgomery decided to open a segregated colors branch, as many libraries were opening across the country, separate and unequal facilities for Black people in libraries, she was offered the opportunity to head the colored branch. So it was important to be in this site where one of the first Black librarians in the South to be hired by a public library, where she worked and really innovated. But also it was important to be in a place where an informationist like Joanne Robinson, who also worked at Alabama State University, where she, after the Black community had voted, after Rosa Parks had, stood her ground in terms of not getting up out of her seat, there was a vote held by, in the community to see, did Black people want to boycott? And when it was a unanimous yes, she really masterminded the communications around that, what I call an informatics of the civil rights movement, in which with one mimeograph machine and with some students at ASU, she created over 35,000 pamphlets, carefully worded and sized, in order to get the word out to people who, near and far, because Montgomery has a large landmass. So I wanted to be in this place where, simultaneously you have a scholarship meeting movement building, information meeting movement building, and also where we could trace and connect to an informatics of the civil rights movement. So for me, no better place than Montgomery.
Well, I agree with you. I know that was a fascinating initiative. And, we're kind of talking about the barriers to becoming a librarian and those who've overcome it. And yet only about 6.8% of librarians in the U.S. identify as Black. Black communities are among libraries' most consistent users and advocates, and especially public libraries. And I remember you sharing that with me when you were the librarian of the library in Hartford. Can you talk, and you're the first African-American woman to lead ALA in the 150-year history. Can you talk a little bit about why diversifying the library workforce is not just a matter of representation, but a matter of what information gets collected, preserved, and made accessible? What is actually lost when the people running these institutions don't reflect the communities they serve?
Yeah, for sure. That's really a sore spot, for me, because I think the fact that our numbers, are continuing to go down is problematic. And, I want to add to that, we're not at 7%, as you said, for Black librarians, but the number of Black archivists is even lower, right? So it's only about 3%, and archivists are really about preservation. They're about, also finding out, what is important to a community, not just now, but later, and preserving that. And I think of how many collections, how many, there's an African proverb that says when an elder dies, a library burns to the ground, right? And I think often that, who is going into the homes as a professional, not somebody who might I like that or I want that, but somebody who's thinking about historic provenance or community relevance or what this, the interpretive value, of a document or of an object. Too many of our elders' homes, right, especially those of us who grew up on the West Coast, where values of homes, grow exponentially, where we've seen maybe our fifth or sixth great wave of gentrification, right? It is about, in that process of removal, what gets retained. So I always want to bring up archivists. But I think that, there is something that we have to do, which is to encourage young people to look at librarianship and to look at archival work as a first career. I think we don't, it's sort of self-fulfilling in that you don't see a Black librarian, you don't see a Black archivist, and therefore you might not aspire to it, where, we also need to increase our numbers in teaching, but you are, it's that same cycle of when you see, when there's a teacher who really sort of opens up your imagination, who really compels you and excites you, you're more likely to want to be a teacher. And so we tend to want to be what we see. And I think that our field is hidden in plain sight. I also think, and I want to be honest, that there is something exclusionary about librarianship that we have to get at the heart of. I mean, I think that there is something that in a lot of ways replicates the status quo too often. And so that sense of belonging, that sense of also of reflection, that I see myself reflected here, we have to work on that. But more, what I tried to do in my own career is to say to people, one of the most important decisions I ever made is to decide to become a librarian. Mm-hmm. And this is where this career has taken me. It has taken me across the country. It has taken me to nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, state-run and city-run institutions. It's taken me to panels doing presentations literally across the world. It is a place where my deep interest in Africa and my deep interest in art and my deep interest in fashion or material culture, where I've been able to satisfy that. And so I want to say to anybody who is listening right now, if you are interested in librarianship, look at the Spectrum Scholarship at the American Library Association to support underrepresented groups in libraries, and look at the Society of American Archivists for the same type of access point. And also look at the Black Caucus of the American Library Association to kind of see who are librarians, where are they working at EPA and in medical hospitals and law firms. Many of them are working in nonprofits and leading organizations as well as your public and your academic and your special libraries, your school libraries. So I'm hoping that might help in some ways bridge a gap. But what gets lost when we don't have them is that we aren't collecting, is that we aren't creating a condition where we can see ourselves on shelves or in spaces of preservation. And so much is lost. So much is lost when it is not just representation, it's preservation of culture. And that is the work of the librarian. That is the work of the archivist.
Wow, Dr. Tracy D. Hall. This has been such an amazing, enlightening, illuminating, and engaging conversation. I remember meeting you as a 17-year-old at UC Santa Barbara, and you said you wanted to be a librarian, and you have more than done that. Thank you so much for joining us today on KPFA, and maybe we'll be back in the future to talk more about Black Information Futures. Thank you for listening.
The Stern Grove Festival returns for the 2026 summer season, and KPFA is once again a media sponsor. The summer concert series kicks off Sunday, June 14th with the Peter Cat Recording Company and ends on Sunday, August 16th with Al Green. For more information, tickets, and to see the full lineup, visit sterngrove.org. This is a wheelchair-accessible event.
The following is brought to you by no one trying to sell you anything. This is 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online everywhere. Tell a friend at kpfa.org.